Once I heard a famous doctor say, "We are all stories in the end. Just make it a good one, eh?" And as a clinical psychologist, I found this premise to be particularly interesting because I'm somewhat in the business of stories. Throughout my career, my role has involved sitting across from individuals, groups, couples, and families as they tell their stories through each of their individual lenses. These lenses are often tinted based upon our social location, our individual experiences, our intergenerational patterns passed down through our families, our values, the ways in which we spend our days and our attention, our biological makeup, our beliefs, our dreams, our anxieties, and countless other factors. Outside of us, our stories change based upon the year we were born, the society we were born into, events within our world, and too many variables to list or even mention. At times, these stories challenge us to do that which is so important to us or compel us towards many beautiful moments, big and small. These stories drive us towards unimaginable achievements, powerful influence, and show-stopping performances. Other times, the story isn't so useful. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves discourage us from even starting, impede our connection to those we hold most dear, or propel us towards behaviors that we will soon come to regret. Before I go on, and for the sake of full disclosure, the quote wasn't necessarily from an actual doctor, but the actor Matt Smith playing a doctor, the 11th Doctor, as a matter of fact, on the iconic television show of Doctor Who. And if you enjoy a far-flung story, I couldn't recommend it more. However, I also realize that we are all the authors of our own far-flung stories. We are all holding the pen or have our fingers resting on the keyboard on how our individual stories are written. What if we could make it a good one, eh? Oftentimes, these stories exist at a pre-conscious level. It doesn't mean we can't zoom out and pay closer attention, but we don't always choose to shift our focus in a way that allows us to see the advantages and challenges in exactly how we're crafting our own stories. That's not to say we're all a pack of liars or that our stories are untrue, but we must simply acknowledge that we construct these narratives through all of the aforementioned factors, and that many I didn't mention. That doesn't make our stories false, but it does make them a matter of perspective, and we all do it. For example, I'm the mother of two beautiful little boys, ages 4 and 6. And while we have a lot of really good moments, oftentimes those hours between 5:30 and 7:30 p.m. as we're trying to get everyone off to bedtime can be a bit challenging. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to do a one-on-one solo bedtime with my youngest son, while my oldest was at basketball practice with his dad. It wasn't that magical moment I had envisioned, that precious one-on-one time that we get so infrequently, but instead it was a really trying, really challenging effort to get him to finally get his beautiful little head to rest on his pillow. When that happened, I turned around, walked out of his room, and breathed a sigh of relief. Unfortunately, I didn't have much time to recover because in that moment, I heard the garage door open, and I knew I was about to launch right back into another bedtime scenario. Internally, I thought to myself, ugh, I have to do another bedtime. Do you notice what I said there? Have to. Pretty quickly, I realized that this way in which I was telling my story was going to get in the way of my ability to connect to my oldest son, one of my most invaluable relationships. And I realized that I'm only going to have a handful of years in which we have this type of relationship. The moment I shifted the way in which I was constructing the narrative, it changed my attitude, it changed my behavior, and it led to a really positive experience and moment of connection with somebody who was really important to me. An alternative example is if I'm running down the street, my palms are sweaty, I have a bead of sweat running down my back, I'm breathing heavily. I'm going to interpret that information very differently if I'm training for a marathon than when I'm running from a bear. The situation is the same, but the story makes all the difference in how we experience the moment at hand. How we respond and plays a role in what happens next. If we neglect to attend to our stories or pay attention to the ways in which these stories influence us, we may find ourselves missing out on opportunities to change the bigger narrative. Many of the bits and pieces that inform our method of storytelling occurred beyond our sphere of influence. After all, I don't imagine anyone had much say in which family they were born into, what decade they would exist, their individual traumas, even some of their most glowing successes. We aren't simply powerful enough to control all that we would need to control to change the patterns we use to integrate all of the information that comprises these stories. And yet, if we wish to experience positive emotions, lead fuller lives, engage in behaviors consistently with our values, we are responsible for attending to these stories. In order to begin to no longer be like a 6-year-old leash training a 90-pound golden doodle, simply drug around by the stories our brains tell us, we must be intentional about attending to our stories, looking at the different angles and considering a different perspective. We need to cultivate a pattern of intentional curiosity to attend to the ways in which these stories impact our moods, our behaviors, our relationships, the physical sensations that show up within our bodies, our work, and our general satisfaction with the product that is our lives. We are often too close to our own stories to be able to see them clearly. We become so joined with them that we often fail to see them for what they are, and we become so fused with these narratives that we fail to consider what they aren't. We become so connected to these stories that we treat them as if they are a reality and interact with the world as if these stories are objective truths instead of a construct of our own creation. And that makes sense, doesn't it? We're all so busy with thousands of tasks that comprise our daily lives. We often operate on a form of autopilot. Thus, in order to see these stories more clearly, we need to turn off the cruise control and shift towards that bird's eye view of the road. Unfortunately, simply seeing the story isn't often quite enough to lead to that overarching change we all crave. There are some practices we can use to gain better traction with some of these stories that have been dragging us around. One useful method is to regard the story with some distance. Tell the story out loud or write it down, but change the pronouns you utilize and tell the story as if it happened to someone else. Or even get real bougie with it and speak of yourself in third person like some self-important social media influencer. Another option is to treat the story as if it were a dream. It doesn't make it less real, it just makes it less tangible and therefore less powerful. We can be mindful to not act on our stories, instead just sit with them, marinate in them, and notice how you feel compelled to act, the thoughts and feelings that show up for you, the bodily sensations that emerge, and just sit with them and be curious about whatever chooses to show up. Finally, we can avoid getting caught up in our stories by remaining in contact with the present moment, practicing mindfulness, and noticing when these stories are whisking us away to a far off and unhelpful place. We loosen our grip, return to the present moment. That's hard though, and it takes a lot of practice. Ultimately, whatever we choose to do, we are responsible for releasing our hold on those stories that no longer serve us. The things that we tell ourselves that are taking us further away from that which we are seeking on our journey. In the end, Doctor Who is a brilliant character and a remarkable story. But I can't help but think that maybe we aren't all simply stories in the end. Perhaps we're more of a collection of storytellers, holding our pens or sitting with our fingers settled on the keyboard, writing the narrative that leads to the greatest likelihood of a life worth living. And while I don't envision a world in which my story is filled with time travel, alien planets, or even the experience of baking a really good souffle, let's make it a good one, okay?